I think that storytelling is something that is very complicated. I think it's very hard to do well, which is why we get so many piece of crap movies or books or TV shows, etc. And I think that one of the many places where so many people go wrong is they mess up when it comes to exaggeration. Because there are so many things that happen in different kinds of stories that just don't really feel realistic, if such a thing exists. And there's a lot to love about everyday life, there's a lot to adore, there's a lot that is beautiful. But if you are trying to tell something that is gripping, something that is just a fantastic story that's easy to follow, that's fun, that's enjoyable, then you maybe don't want to leave in the parts where the characters go to the bathroom.
For crying out loud, is it too much to ask for some privacy? I'll be out when it's done.
Whenever you're telling a story, you need to justify the time spent telling that story, and you need to justify the reader or the listener's time being used to listen to that story. And so the most effective way to do that is to just fast forward to the good parts, essentially. It is to effectively remove any boring parts, any parts that might be dull or rote or routine. And not only do you remove the boring stuff, you accentuate the good stuff. It can't just be a kind of good day that someone had, it has to be the best day ever. Or if you are looking at the case of Max Payne, it can't be a story about a man who had a kind of bad day. It has to be a story about a man who has a consistently bad life. The very first thing that happens in the first game of the series is that Max comes home from work, he's a cop, and he comes home to find his wife and baby murdered by junkies. And that's how the game begins. And so I think you need that kind of catalyst, you need that kind of crazy major event in order to pull people in. If you want a game where Max Payne goes and kills like thousands of people, then you need something extraordinary to happen to trigger that. I think that extraordinary events require extraordinary triggers. And this is a completely normal thing. It's something that every piece of media does. So every story needs some kind of exaggeration in that regard. But the thing is that if you exaggerate things too far, then it becomes cliche. It becomes cartoony. It feels unreal in the worst way imaginable. It feels unbelievable in the worst way imaginable. Or if you want to exaggerate something and make it super, super dark, then it becomes kind of questionable because it becomes edgy. Or rather, it's not guaranteed to become edgy, but I think that you're more likely to have people pointing at it and declaring that it is edgy than not. If it passes a certain point, that is. What I find really interesting about Max Payne is that the first game is able to exaggerate the crap out of everything, but it is able to get away with it because it is self-aware and it has a sense of humor. And so I think because of this, then it gets to have its cake and eat it too. And I think this is true to a slightly lesser extent for the second game, and I'll explain more on that later. And the third game has different priorities, so we'll touch on that also. The premise of the first game is that after Max comes home and finds his wife and baby dead, then he decides to become an undercover DEA agent and to try to infiltrate the various gangs of New York City. He's really just trying to figure out who's responsible for the drugs that were supplied to the people that killed his family. And then once he figures it out, he proceeds to murder everyone. And there are so many exaggerated aspects of this first game. The first exaggerated aspect is that he has nothing to lose, right? He lost his family. He doesn't have a home, really. At the very beginning of the game, his cover as a DEA agent is blown, so he doesn't have that to return to. This allows him to be the absolutely brutal killer that we all know and love. Another aspect of the character that's exaggerated is his internal monologues and his dialogue with other characters. He's constantly spitting out these thoughtful metaphors, and even though the premise of the game isn't all that crazy, he's able to make it interesting because of just the way that he tells his story.
It wasn't about how smart or how good you were. It was chaos and luck, and anyone who thought different was a fool. All you could do was to hang on madly, as long and as hard as you could.
The game takes place in New York City, but it takes place during the worst winter storm that the city has ever seen. And not only that, but the game takes place exclusively at night. So you have this really exaggerated, dark, seedy, kind of gross environment. Every setting you visit in this game is pretty crazy and over the top. It's always some hole-in-the-wall bar, or some gothic nightclub, or the end of the game has these giant, huge buildings that are owned by these massive corporations, or government labs. And so with these settings, they're always the worst of the worst, or they're the best of the best. They're either the grossest, dingiest places you can imagine, or they are very nice and clean and elegant. Like Max, every other character is exaggerated in some way, shape, or form. The gangsters are primarily stereotypical Italian mobsters that are just stereotypes. There's no other way around it.
Oh my god! Oh god, you shot me! Ah!
Or the one mobster who isn't Italian is a Russian guy who has a license plate that says vodka, and who in the second game then opens up a club called Vodka because he's Russian. Get it? It's very deep. In the first game, there are a lot of people who are hopped up on a fictional drug called Valkyr, including a guy who believes himself to be Mr. Beast.
I'm Mr. Beast.
There's a mobster who is an interrogator who interrogates people with a baseball bat, and at the scene of every crime, he leaves behind a Captain Baseball Batboy comic strip. So the entire game is really over the top, I think. And I think what the game is doing is it's playing around with a lot of these classic noir tropes and cliches. But the fact of the matter is that if it were a story told by anyone less skilled, then it would come off as cliche itself. It would come off as stupid or poorly written. Because again, this is a game that is about a man who loses his family and then proceeds to murder everyone over the course of 3 nights. This is one of my favorite descriptions of Max Payne.
Max killed half the city in a night. Twice!
So, like I was saying, as a writer, you want to exaggerate things. You don't want to just dwindle in realism. You don't want to avoid doing something cool because, quote-unquote, it's not realistic. If it's something cool and it helps the story and it helps reinforce the points you're making, you should do it. But again, if you push it too far, if you exaggerate things too far, then it becomes unrealistic and it just goes too far in that direction. It's a balancing act. But I find that what Max Payne does is actually super interesting because it doubles down on all of those exaggerated things that I mentioned earlier. Again, it's the worst storm in New York City history, or it's a single man who takes down pretty much all of New York's gangs in 3 nights. And he does so while cracking jokes.
I'm Frankie the Bat Niagara.
Niagara, as in you cry a lot? He had a baseball bat and I was tied to a chair. Pissing him off was the smart thing to do.
And again, the game is dark. Like I said, the very beginning of the game starts off with the brutal murder of his family, and he then relives it a couple times in the form of nightmare levels, which are in and of themselves a nightmare to play. So the way it gets around this problem of having the game be way too over the top or having it come off as too edgy, the way it gets around this is by injecting humor into the game. The game is self-aware. The game knows it's a game, and it even goes so far as to say that.
I was in a computer game. Funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
And I think in the second game, some of the humor is more obvious. So for instance, in one level you have to protect a gang leader who's dressed in a Captain Baseball Batboy costume that has a bomb in it. And it's hilarious because he gets stuck and he can't go through certain doorways. And so the game is able to kind of sidestep the issue of coming off as too edgy potentially by just having jokes, by just being fun. It's not a game that takes itself way too seriously or anything like that. And I'm not gonna lie, in the first couple of games, I think that there are times when it goes too far in that direction. I think it goes too far in the direction of being funny. So for instance, in each Max Payne game, there are TVs that you can watch. And in the second game, they do this really kind of interesting thing where they have a couple shows that display on TVs throughout the level. And as you go through the game, each time you find a TV, you can watch an episode of a show on the TV. And basically you can watch the entire series of a show that way. And sometimes it's just funny. For instance, one of the shows is called Lords and Ladies, and it's a kind of parody of fantasy shows. And Max Payne 2 is really the game that doubles down on all of this. And the problem for me with it was that I spent a huge amount of time just watching the TV shows. And I think that was the point, right? They wouldn't have included the TV shows unless they wanted you to watch them. But the problem with it was that it took me out of the game too often. It became more of a distraction. The humor became more of a distraction than something that felt necessary to balance out the darkness. And so the first game is really over the top. The villains really don't have any depth. They strike me as caricatures more than anything else. But the second game is more serious. I think it's a better written game. That's not to say that I prefer the story of the second game, because I'm not sure if I do, but I think that all of the characters have significantly more depth. I think that Sam Lake, the writer of the first 2 games, by the time that they started work on Max Payne 2, he was a better writer than he was when he started the first game. And so the game is just better written, I think. but the game takes itself a bit more seriously. And in doing so, I can't help but feel like it lost some of the more exaggerated, crazy aspects of the first game. So for instance, the setting of the game is not as exaggerated as it was in the first game. There is no crazy winter storm happening. It's just kind of New York, it's just fall. And the villains, the gangsters in the second game, are given more depth. Because the main villain of the second game is the Russian from the first game who had the license plate Vodka, who has now opened a nightclub called Vodka. And even though that's silly, he has significantly more depth and more going on. You learn about his complicated, strange love life and how that fits into things. And you learn about his backstory and who his mentor was, and it just kind of gives him a lot more depth than he initially had. But again, there's still the humor. Some of the exaggeration from the first game may not have carried over to the second, but I think that all of the humor did, plus more. Like I said, for me, I found that it was a bit too much at times, but your mileage may vary. But regardless, I think that the game still maintains that sense of self-awareness that the first game had. It is a video game that knows it's a video game. And so even though the game asks some pretty hefty questions about love and death and life and how it all fits together, I still think that this is a game that was made and designed to be fun. And you can see that with how the bullet time works and just how there's this kind of absurd, stupid reload animation where the camera spins around Max and it does a 360 thing, and it's kind of absurd. So in the second game, I think that you have some of the exaggeration that was found in the first game, but I think a lot of it kind of was lost in transition. But I still think it kept the humor. Now, the third game came out 9 years after the second one and was made by a different team. It was written by different people. And so by that point, I can't help but feel that pretty much all of the exaggeration that the first couple games had is gone. Max Payne 3 feels more realistic, quote unquote, and I kind of hate using that word because it just feels so overused as to be meaningless. But it feels like it attempted to be a more grounded game. Did it succeed in that? I mean, I feel like Max Payne shoots like 1,500 grenades out of the air and 1,500 missiles, and so it's like, I don't know that I would call this realistic in any way, shape, or form, but it feels like the game wanted to tackle serious real-world issues of poverty and wealth inequality. If I'm being completely honest, it feels much darker because it does feel more grounded. It feels like a game that is set in the real world, as opposed to the kind of crazy, absurd, blizzard-covered New York City of the first game. So Max Payne 3 is a somewhat divisive game. I think that pretty much everyone agrees that the gameplay is great, but whether or not you like where the story went is kind of up to you. Personally, I'm somewhat divided on it right now, but I do think this is a major reason why fans of the first two games might not like the third one as much, because it lost that exaggeration, it lost that humor and that comedy. In other words, I think that in some ways they finally kind of tried to complete Max's transformation from a cartoon character in the first game into a kind of real and actual person in the third game. And that's not to say that he didn't have depth in the first two games, because he 100% did. And I'm not even saying that he has more depth in the third one than he did in the first two. But what I am saying is that in the third game, he doesn't feel as absurd. Or at the very least, what I'm trying to say is that in Max Payne 3, the writers were not as self-aware as Sam Lake maybe was for the first two games. So in the end, I don't think that you have to have humor to balance out everything. I don't think that every single game or movie or book needs to have a Marvel-style joke in any serious moment. That's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if you can make people laugh, then they'll let you get away with a lot more. And I think that's true not just of storytelling, but of anything. So that's what I got. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful night.
Ah!